Good morning. Welcome to North Church. Welcome those of you who are joining us online. So glad that you find yourself here today. I believe that God wants to speak to you wherever you are in your life. Here's what I know. I'm for sure one of the challenging people in our church. Absolutely. Hey, we're in a series called God's Redemption Story. This is a 18-month plan that we want to take our church through the entire story arc of the Bible, that the story is about God. It's always been about Him and His redemption and bringing those back to Him. And so that's what we've been going through. We just finished the entire book of Genesis, and we're moving into Exodus through Joshua. And throughout this, we had this heart that our church would come into knowledge of the story of the Bible, but also meet with God personally in an intimate way on a daily basis, that it wouldn't just be Sunday mornings, but it'd be every single day. And so we had a couple authors in our church put together a devotional plan, and we have a new one launching today. And so if you have the Bible app, you can scan the QR code that's behind me here, and you can sign up for our new Bible reading plan that'll follow the sermons that we're doing, Exodus through Joshua. And it'll be great. And so I just want to encourage you to do that. If you don't have the Bible app on your phone downloaded, I want to encourage you, download the YouVersion Bible app and set North Church as your home church and follow along with us as we engage in this new Bible reading plan. It's going to be great. So I thought that either one, I could kind of catch everyone up through the entire book of Genesis and then where we're headed in Exodus, and that would be relatively boring and uninspiring, or I could play this really great video for you. So last service, for whatever reason, we had some technology issues. It didn't work. So this might be the service that this works. So we can all pray together that it does. So let me play this video for you and kind of catch you up to where we are and then also kind of where we're headed.
From darkness to light, this is the story we all share as the people of God. He draws us out to draw us in. From the birth of Israel to the church today, God delivers and dwells with His people. This story began several thousand years ago, and it began with a promise from God to Abraham that he would make his offspring more numerous than the stars in the sky, a great nation who would one day dwell in the promised land. More than 400 years passed, and Abraham's descendants had not seen this promise fulfilled. Instead, the Israelites lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt. Fearing that the Hebrews would grow into a mighty nation and overtake them, the Pharaoh of Egypt forced them to work as slaves. But Israel continued to grow. In response, the Egyptians increased their oppression of God's people, and Pharaoh gave a terrible decree. Every son born to the Hebrews would be thrown into the river. But a Levite couple defied this order, trusting God's will for their son's life. And God did have a plan for this child. Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and took pity on him. She named him Moses because he was drawn out of the water. As Moses grew older and saw the suffering of his people, anger burned within him. When he witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, Moses killed the man and fled Egypt to hide in the desert. Years passed, and Moses made a new life for himself in Midian. Then one day the voice of the Lord called out to him from a burning bush. God told Moses that he saw the persecution of his people in Egypt, and he heard their cries. He promised to deliver the Israelites from slavery, and he commanded Moses to go before Pharaoh on their behalf. Moses was terrified, so God sent Moses' brother Aaron to go with him. The brothers went before Pharaoh, performing signs and wonders, but Pharaoh would not listen. So God brought down plagues upon Egypt. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard as stone. To prepare for the 10th and final plague, the Hebrews marked their doors with the blood of spotless lambs. That night, the angel of death passed through the kingdom, killing the firstborn child of every Egyptian household that did not bear the mark, including Pharaoh's. Heartbroken, Pharaoh told the Israelites to go. They were finally set free, and the Spirit of God led the people out and toward the Promised Land. But Pharaoh's grief soon turned to rage. He changed his mind and then commanded the Egyptian army to pursue them. When the Israelites came to the Red Sea, Moses lifted his staff to the sky and the waters parted. The Hebrews passed through the towering waves, and the Egyptians were swallowed by the sea. God had indeed drawn his people out of bondage, out of darkness, and into the light of his presence. The story of Israel is the story of us today. We are God's people. He draws us out of our sin, our Egypt, and draws us into his presence, into relationship with him.
So that is kind of a summary of where we've been and also where we're going to be headed through the book of Exodus and then beyond. And today we're going to be focusing on that moment that you saw there of the burning bush, where Moses encounters this burning bush and God interrupts Moses' daily routine and life and sends him on this great calling and mission. And it got me thinking of how God interrupts our life, but then it also made me think of how we get interrupted all the time in our daily life. And if you're a parent in here, you get interrupted every single day, hundreds of times, because your kids love to come and interrupt. And so you could be in like a really deep conversation, and then your kids come and interrupt you. And they're like, today you will not be having a deep conversation as a married couple. I'm going to come interrupt you time after time after time. And so we know this. You've probably been in the midst of like a project in work and you just get interrupted over and over again. And it can be a little frustrating because we like to have our plan of how things go. And then when anything interrupts that, it shakes our world. And it made me think of this time, and my dad's told this story before, but I'm going to tell it from my perspective, is that there was this time when my brother and I, we were younger, probably grade school age, and my parents had this hard and fast rule that you do not interrupt. You have to say, excuse me, and then you wait. Now, you might wait 10 seconds, but you also might wait 10 minutes. That was just the rule. And if you didn't follow that rule, there was punishment, severe punishment. And so spankings is what it was. And so there's this one time we're in the car. And we're driving, and my brother has some drink with some ice in it, and he drinks, and he's drinking this, and he starts choking on a piece of ice. And I'm in the backseat of the car with my brother, and he's choking on ice. And here, is this moment. As the younger brother, I have all the power. Looking at my brother, and as he's choking on this ice, and all the times that he ruled over me, right? I'm like, your life is in my hands. What am I going to do with it? And it let him kind of panic, and I was just like. And then I tapped my mom on her shoulder, and I was like, excuse me. And she was like, not now, Nathan. And then I looked at Zach, and I'm like. And he's like choking, and I'm like, what shall I do with all this power I have? And he's like getting blue in the face and whatnot. And it sounds kind of morbid, right? My train of thinking, but if you're a younger brother, you know exactly what I'm talking about right now, right? And so finally I tap my mom on her shoulder again, and I'm like, excuse me. And she's like, what, Nathan? And she looks around and she sees Zach's like blue face, and I'm like, and so they pull the car over, give him the Heimlich, and Zach, he pops the ice out and he's alive. And so as we drive away, and everything's okay, and they're like, oh my gosh, like we should have that the excuse me rule is only works under non-life-threatening situations. And we're like, well, you needed to clarify that, Mom and Dad. And as we drove away, I'm like, Zach, you can thank me later. Your life is spared like Moses' life was spared. I have saved you. But obviously, we can get interrupted in our daily routines. And I believe that God still interrupts us when we think life is going a certain way and how it should go a certain way through a variety of things, whether it be situations, unexpected life events, encounters with other people, that God still interrupts us. And sometimes he himself will interrupt us, maybe even in a church service like this, that he'll come in and say, I'm going to interrupt your daily routine. And this is kind of what happens with Moses. He's in his daily routine. God interrupts him with this burning bush, and then Moses has a choice to how he's going to respond. So here's kind of the big idea for us today is that God still sends us on mission, but he promises his presence, his power, and his favor will be with us. And so as we come into Exodus chapter 3, where Moses encounters this burning bush, here's what's happened. 40 years had passed since he had murdered that Egyptian who was harming one of his Israelite brothers. And he had fled to Midian, and he had had a new family, he had had children, he had become a shepherd, and he's just tending sheep. And 40 years had passed. He's 80 years old now. So anyone who's a little bit more seasoned in life, this should encourage you that God will still come to you even in later years in life and says, I am not done with you yet. I still have plans and purposes for your life. And so this is what happens. And this burning bush flames up, and Moses looks at it and says, I'm going to go investigate this. And so in Exodus chapter 3, verse 2 is where we'll begin. So let's look at this. It says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And Moses, he looked, and behold, the bush was not burning, yet it was consumed. Now, what's taking place here, just really quickly, just a little side trail, is this is what's called a theophany. A theophany is God manifesting himself in the midst of this bush, or here, a theophany is God manifesting himself in a physical form, in the form of a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. So once Jesus was born, he was God incarnate in human flesh. Prior to that, he didn't have a physical body. And so this is God manifesting himself in a physical form to speak to Moses. And he manifests in the form of this flame. And then he speaks out of it. But fire oftentimes is used to resemble God's presence. So we see that, we saw that a couple weeks ago when we looked at Abraham and the covenant with Abraham, when he had split the animals in two, and that flame had passed through the animals. This was a representation of God's presence. When God led the Israelites out of Egypt and in the wilderness, he led them by a pillar of fire by day. On Mount Sinai, God came down as fire, or the day of Pentecost in the New Testament, there was pillars of fire over each one of the disciples. And so God shows himself oftentimes as fire, because fire is both inviting, and it invites us in, but it's also terrifying and powerful. Kind of like if any of you have a fire pit, and you sit around your fire pit, or you go camping and you have the fire going, the crackly fire, it's got the smells and the feels. It invites us in, right, as family. My wife and I, we got this thing called a solo stove recently, which is like this double-walled fire pit thing that like burns the wood and the smoke. So it's like, a smokeless fire pit thing, and we'll all sit around it, and it like invites family in and conversation, and it's warm, and it invites you in. You know what I'm talking about. But fire also, it's inviting, but it's also terrifying in the sense that like you get too close, like it's going to burn you, or it can consume, all this wood. It can burn a whole forest down. And so fire is this one thing that's inviting, but it's also terrifying in the sense that it's so powerful. And this is kind of who God is God reveals himself to Moses, and he reveals himself to us, that God is inviting, and he invites us in to come near and to draw near. But God is also, in one sense, terrifying in the sense that he's all powerful. He's transcendent over everything. He rules over everything. He's in control over everything. He is all powerful, mighty God. So he is one transcendent, all powerful, but he is also what's called immanent. He is with us, and he invites us near, and he's among us. So he's over us, transcendent and immanent, with us, among us. And so this is who God is. Now, Christianity is different than many religions. Many religions might view God as just transcendent, all-powerful, but he's not immanent, near and among us, that he's this powerful God up there looking down, and you're trying to work your way to him, but he's not in it and among his people. He's just up there, he's going to throw a lightning bolt down. Or there's other, religions, think of more of the Eastern religions, and where God is he's not transcendent, he's not all-powerful and over everything, he's just immanent, he's just in everything. So this is like Avatar. Avatar is like where you take your ponytail and plug it into the tree, and then it's like God's in it, and you feel him, he's in the rocks, and he's in the tree, and he's in the river, and Avatar is the immanence of God taken too far is what that is, where you plug your ponytail in and he's just in everything. And what Christianity has always said is that God is both transcendent. He is all powerful and over everything. He rules over everything. But he's also immanent, not in the tree where you plug your ponytail into, but he's immanent in that he's in and among and with his people. He is both transcendent and he is immanent. He invites us in, but he is also all-powerful over everything. And so here in verse 3, Moses sees this burning bush, and it says, and Moses said, well, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And so God interrupts Moses' life. He doesn't know it's God yet, but there's this little interruption to his day because Moses just thought he's a shepherd now. 40 years as a shepherd, a new family, a new life, and he's just tending his sheep is all he's doing. And he's trying to get his sheep from, this pasture or this hill over to that pasture or that hill. And then there's this little burning bush. God interrupts his day. God could have set the entire mountain on fire, but instead he just has this one little burning bush. And so this begs the question, because God interrupted Moses' life then, is that does God still interrupt our life now? And I think that's something that we should think about often, and even today. Does God still interrupt our lives to get us to turn aside, like Moses did, so that we might pause from our daily routines? And then to think, God, what are you doing here? And I believe that God does do this in a variety of ways, and often actually. But he doesn't necessarily do it in a burning bush anymore. He'll do it through his son Jesus, through his word, and those who he indwells. That God doesn't just indwell, won't come down in a theophany in the sense of like a burning bush, but God now indwells us. We are the temple of God as his people. And God indwells his people, and he is in and among us. And so he uses us often as burning bushes for others. And we get interrupted by God's people or spending time with Jesus. We might get interrupted through a situation or an unexpected life event. And these are the things that whatever causes you to pause and reevaluate, whether it be reevaluating in a small way or a big way, oftentimes this is God interrupting our daily life or our own agenda, what we thought we were going to do this day, this week, this month, this year, and he asks us to pause and turn aside. And one way this might play out, because God uses his people often, is that maybe you've had a moment before where someone comes to you, and maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a stranger, maybe it's just an acquaintance at work. And you've never had like a significant, deep relationship with them, but then they come to you, or maybe it's in a group, whatnot, and in that, out of an act of vulnerability, they lay something down, and they say, here's something I'm going through. And you have this moment that you can either kind of be like, ooh, that was kind of heavy, and that was a lot for like this conversation, and just kind of breeze past it. Or you can pause, and you might be able to be that like interruption to their day in an act of vulnerability, interruption to their day where you could even be like that burning bush, where you listen carefully, and then you ask questions, and you respond in a way that allows another person to feel seen and heard. And maybe even in that, they feel like that could have been like a burning bush, God using you in another person's life. Or you can just continue like maybe like a more surface relationship and then just kind of fluff it off. But God wants to use you, and he wants to use others, that when you bring things out of like, here's what's going on in my life, God will use a variety of different people to speak and to have you reevaluate, that God will use those things. That when people stop us and share something vulnerable, or when you do that with someone else, there's a chance to interrupt a cycle of surfaceness. That gets interrupted, and then God uses that to speak in many different ways. And I think this happens, and I can think of a couple different instances in my life, and one was, about 8-9 years ago when I was on a sabbatical, and I'm trying to reevaluate, taking a pause from ministry, reevaluate my life, and I had met with a handful of people. There was just about 2 or 3 people I met with just to go like, here's kind of what's going on in my life. What do you think? And I'm so thankful that those who I met with stopped and paused, listened, asked good questions, and then responded, encouraged me, helped guide me in like some directional paths. And it was just a few people who did that caused me to pause and reevaluate as I was vulnerable with them. Because at the time, what I was thinking about was, I think I should just go and plant a church. I had been a youth pastor for 10 years. And it's like, well, the next natural course of events would be, I just go and plant a church, and I'll have a church somewhere else in town. And that's just what I'm going to go and do. But then through this, it caused me to pause and reevaluate, and others were there. And I remember at the end of this sabbatical, I had these conversations, I'm thinking about it, and paused and reevaluating, and I'd just gone to a weekend church planting retreat where everyone there is about to plant a church, and they're really excited about it. And as I'm driving back from that with my wife, and I just remember in the car, we're talking about this, and I just said, you know what, hon, I'm not going to plant a church. And she was just like, oh, okay, that's fine. I support you. And I remember getting back and telling people like, I'm not going to plant a church. And they're like, well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm going to go back to school. And that's what I did. And I'm so thankful, because then I got to see God work not only before that, but then through that, and then where he's brought me today. And I'm just so thankful for those people who are willing to pause, not be surface about it, but then just to respond. And God speaks in those types of ways when we're willing to do that for other people, but then also when we're willing to be vulnerable with other people, that God will still interrupt our lives. And he'll use people, situations, life circumstances, unexpected life events. And then in that, it's when we turn aside, like Moses did, and see what is God doing here. And then this is where God begins to speak. And so we see in verse 4, Moses turns aside, and it says, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now notice here that God waited. God waited to see if Moses was going to respond. He waited, the bush is burning, and he waited to see if Moses was going to turn aside and respond. And then that's when he did, because he was waiting to see if Moses was going to be faithful with the small little things. Because again, he could have put the whole mountain on fire, but he put one little bush on fire to see, is Moses going to be faithful with the small things? Will you be faithful with the small interruptions before I give you the significant calling? He waited to form Moses' character as he was a shepherd. There's a clear, parallel here to Moses being a shepherd of sheep, to then in leading those sheep out of danger and, all along the right paths, to Moses being the shepherd of a nation and leading them. And so God's building and forming his character. Even though Moses had probably ran from God, even though Moses had not been in fellowship with God, God is still using these events to build into Moses' character, into his life, and forming him through this to see, will you be faithful with this herd of sheep before I allow you to be faithful with this nation of people? And God had been waiting and waiting, and even waited to see if Moses would just turn to see if what is happening with this bush. And it's so easy probably in our own life, because we have our own agenda or mission each and every day, just like Moses did. Moses' agenda that day was, I'm going to get the sheep from here to there. and I got to make sure to do it. I don't want sheep to die. I want to protect them from wolves or from thieves or whatever it may be. He had his mission. And often we have our agenda or our mission each and every day. And we have our days planned out. More than likely, you probably have your day planned out tomorrow. And if you're really on top of it, you got your week planned out already. And if you're like super type A, you got like your the month of November already planned out, all right? But we like to have our things planned out. It's our agenda, it's our mission. And notice how God interrupts him in the midst of his agenda, being a shepherd. And it's easy to think like, well, I guess if God gave me a burning bush, maybe I would stop. But God still interrupts us. And so are we willing to pause from our agenda and whatever we think our mission is to respond to maybe what God has for us in small ways or maybe in big ways? Maybe it's responding like Glendy had shared this morning, like, are you willing to step out of your comfort zone and begin serving? Maybe that's something God has for you. I believe that's not the end-all, be-all by any means, that you serve the church, a few hours here or there. But obviously, there's a starting place there, that our life is a life of servanthood, and we are one church family, and we care for our family together. Maybe God wants to interrupt your agenda or your mission and to say, let me plant this in here. Are you willing to turn aside and say yes to this? And through that, like Moses, his character is being shaped and formed, and God waits as our character is shaped and formed. He entrusts us small things so that he might entrust us with big things. And Moses had been living out of fellowship for 40 years with God. He's 80 years old here. And it was once he turned aside and responded. And Moses responded in a very Old Testament type of way, which when he said, here I am. I'm here and I'm willing. Maybe you've been out of fellowship from God for years, decades, maybe like Moses, 40 years. And what if God was to interrupt your life right now and interrupt where you're at? Maybe you've been out of fellowship with him. Are you willing to turn aside and say, okay, I see that you're interrupting my life, and here I am, and I'm willing to respond however you need me to. So then, as God sees Moses turn, this is how he responds to him. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is all God's saying, I didn't forget the covenants that I made with them and the things that I told them, and I'm still going to fulfill them through you. And then he goes on to say, and now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses was a sinner here. He's out of relationship with God, and God says, I want to use you, the person out of relationship for 40 years, the sinner, the murderer, and the shepherd. Because God never uses perfect people, because none of us are. He uses imperfect people to be used and fulfill his perfect plan. He uses us as sinners and people who are in relationship and out of relationship with God, and he uses us to show that even within our weakness and our sin, that it's God who is perfect and God who is powerful, and it's his strength and it's by his might that things are accomplished. That God is faithful and he will fulfill what he said, and that he has not forgotten. And that God wants to send you, just like he told Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. He sends you and I today. And so where is God sending you? Where has God have you positioned that he says, this is where I want to send you and use you? And if you're out of relationship with him, that could literally start with just a conversation today with, Lord, how do you want to use me just in this church? And it could be something as simple as a conversation with one of us here, but it could also, I don't think that's everything. It could also be as significant as an entire radical reorientation of your entire life in the Lord. And it's really not one or the other. Oftentimes it's both ands. It's just how do we get to that radical way of living for God? How might we leave our comfort zone and our mission and our own personal agenda that we have each and every day for the purpose of the gospel? How might you be a good neighbor to those around you? To be a friend at someone at work? To be on mission in your home? Where is God asking you to press into him? What situation or what life event is happening that God might be asking you not to remain idle? Where is that? And where might God be sending you or asking you to press into him or not be stagnant and idle? For Moses, it was to bring the people out of Egypt, and Moses responds after he says, "Here I am," and God says, "I'm going to send you to bring the people out." He responds with 5 objections. We're going to look at the first 2 objections found in chapter 3. So here's Moses' first objection. Moses' first objection to God saying, "Go to Pharaoh and say, 'Let my people go,' is, who am I to do that? Who am I to be that person to go to Pharaoh?" So in verse 11, this is how Moses responds. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I?" 40 years he had failed to be the deliverer. He had already tried to deliver his people 40 years ago when he murdered that Egyptian for oppressing the Israelite. And then you know what the Israelites said to Moses after he even tried to free him? They said to him, "Who are you to be our deliverer? Who are you to do that?" And he's like, "I just tried to free you." They didn't even want him as their deliverer. And so Moses flees. And he had murdered someone. He had not lived in right relationship with God. And he's probably going like, who am I to do that? I already tried. It didn't work. I murdered someone. I'm a sinner. I've been out of relationship with you. Who am I to fulfill that plan? I could see how maybe you'd use this person or that person, but me? And that oftentimes is our objection to God too. When God asks us to step out, often we say, who am I to do that? Do you know what I've done in my life? Do you know how I live my life? Do you know the circumstances of my life? We might say, well, I could see how you'd use a missionary, a pastor, an evangelist, or at least someone who kind of has their life together. But me? Who am I to step into anything that you would ask of me? And notice here how God responds to Moses. He responds with something very simple. And he just says in Exodus 3:12, he says, "I will be with you." That's how God responds. I'm going to be with you. So he doesn't pat Moses on the back and say, "Oh, it's okay, Moses. You're not that bad. Your murdering isn't that bad." He doesn't pat him on the back. He responds with, "Yes, you're right, Moses. You are not adequate. You are not perfect. You are a sinner. You have been out of relationship with me. It's not about you, Moses." All he says, he doesn't give him the pat on the back. He just says, "Yes, Moses, you're right. But I will be with you. I'm there, and I'm with you." And this is often how God would respond to us. Yes, you're not all that you think you are. Or, sure, you're not worthy. Or yes, you have sinned. Or no, you don't know enough about the Bible. Or no, this plan or this ministry or this business or whatever it may be, sure is too big for you. But I'll be with you. And I'm going with you. Sure, this life event that's taking place, it seems insurmountable. It seems scary. Seems like you're not the right person to accomplish it. Because it's easy to think that it's all up to us. It's up to me. And if I'm not this or I'm not that, then not going to happen. And it's really easy to tie our identity, how we see ourselves, of if I can accomplish it or not, or my accomplishments I've had, or the accomplishments I haven't had. It's easy to tie our identity and what we think we can do or what God would ask of us by just how we see ourselves. And God responds to Moses like he'd respond to you and say, "Sure, but I will be with you." And when we walk through difficult times, when we walk into unexpected territory, and when we walk into things places that maybe we shouldn't belong, it's like, this is above my pay grade, God is with us. Let me explain it this way. that if any one of us right now, we were to go to England and we were to walk up to Buckingham Palace and we would say, hey, I want in. I want to go hang out with the king and I want to, go through all the little rooms and the secret passageways in Buckingham Palace. I want to eat some, scones with the king and I want to hang out. They'd be like, no, categorically, no, you're not allowed in here. And they'd be like, who are you? And you'd be like, well, I'm Nathan Mead. And they'd be like, don't care, get out of here. Right? Any one of us, we'd walk up, that would be the response. And think of Kate Middleton. When Kate Middleton, if she was as like a 15-year-old to walk up to Buckingham Palace and say, hey, I want in and I want to go see the queen and I want to hang out with her. And I want all through the palace and the rooms and the secret passageways and I want to eat a scone with her. They'd be like, no, who are you? And you know what she'd say? Well, I'm Kate Middleton. And they'd be like, who's that? Get out of here. Right? But then she marries Prince William. And now because she marries Prince William, one, she gets a new title. You know what her title is? It is capital H, Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cambridge. And now, because she married him and she is with him, she gets full access to the palace. She's hanging out with the queen. She's going in all the rooms. She's going in the secret passageways and as many scones as she wants. Right? Because they say, who are you? And she says, I am Her Royal Highness, and I am with him. I am the princess married to the prince, and has full access to everything. And this is kind of what God is saying, where he's saying, I will be with you. Kate was a nobody, and now she's everybody. She's everything. And sure, we're nobodies. We're all average, normal people. And things that seem insurmountable, God says, but you're with me. And you have full access. And what seems like a place that you don't belong in, a calling too big, it's reserved for other people and not you. God says, but you're with me. And now, what was off limits maybe, because I'm with you, this is going to get accomplished. Because it's easy to base our sense of self off of who I am. And where God is wanting Moses to respond to and understand just as much as he is us, is that we base our sense of self not on us or myself, but we base our sense of self off of God. That he is for us. He is with us. And what places that we could never accomplish or go with God, all things are possible. And that, God uses us an example where he says we are the bride of Christ. We are the bride of Christ. And with that, there comes a new position and authority in the world. That when he sends us on mission, we are the bride of Christ, and all things are possible through him, not because we're great, but because he's great. And because he's powerful, he's transcendent over all, and he's immanent among and with you in the very thing. That I'm not in control, and I don't have to be. That I can rest in that he is transcendent over everything, that God is in control, and that even within that, he's immanent and he's among you and with you as you walk into those very places. So what situation do maybe you find yourself in today that you're just tempted to say, how am I going to solve this all on my own? And am I worthy based off of my own merits? Because whatever that is, God says, you're not worthy based off of your merits, and you're not going to solve this just based off of you, but based off of me. And everything you've ever accomplished up until this point anyways was because in my transcendent nature, all powerful, I've allowed that to happen. And I've been with you anyways. He is there and he'll be with you. This is Moses' second objection. It's a really important objection too, that he says, what is your name? Now that feels so funny, doesn't it? Like, what kind of objection is that? Moses says to God in verse 13, if I go to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What do I tell them? Doesn't that seem like it's such an insignificant objection? Like, what is your name? But there is so much significance. And I want you all to lean in just a little bit because this is really important here. That Moses, when he asked this question, what is your name? That word what there is the Hebrew word called ma. And that word ma is not asking, who is this God? They already knew who this God was. They were in relationship with him. They were the people of Israel. They still worshiped him, and they knew who this God was. So that word what, ma, is not asking who is this God, nor is it asking by what name should we refer to him as. They knew the name of God. There's clear evidence all through Genesis that they already knew the name of God, Yahweh. They already knew that name. They were in relationship with him and knew what they would refer to him as when they prayed or when they talked to others or when they discipled their children. They knew the name of God. But that word ma, it seeks significance, character, quality, and interpretation contained in the name. Therefore, the ma, it seeks to discover what the name of Yahweh is in reputation and in action. Okay, bear with me. So what does the name mean is this. They're asking, what does this name mean in reputation, in action, and how is it significant in the circumstances that we find ourselves in? This is what the Israelites were asking. Because name has a reputation. For the Israelite culture, an honor society, an honor culture society, names meant things. And your name in that time, it meant something. It carried weight with it. It was like your family resume. It was your family's reputation. And so when you would say like, I'm, Nathan Mead, right? It wasn't just, that's not how you refer to me as, but that's my resume. This is who we are, what we've done, what we act like. It is our reputation as a family. And so for the Israelites, God's reputation to them, they had been in bondage for 400 years. So the reputation of God in their eyes as slaves and in bondage, crying out to him over and over and over again, is his reputation is forgetful. He's unkind. He's harsh. He has stranded us. So when Moses says, when I go to them and say, what is his name? They're going to say, wait, this God who stranded us, left us behind, forgot about us, he's been harsh to us. When I go tell them that, well, what am I supposed to say? Your reputation, who you are. And this is how God responds. God said to Moses, he says, I am who I am. Or the name Yahweh. Or how we read it in our Bibles oftentimes is capital L-O-R-D, all caps. I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this is to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So here, what God is doing is a couple things. One is God is self-defining himself, meaning this, we don't get to define God. The Israelites don't get to define God's character, his reputation, or who he is. And we don't either. Even though we like to try and define God, this is who God is. This is who God has been to me. He has been forgetful. He has been harsh. He has given me poor life circumstances. Or God is whatever. People have tried to define God for centuries. And God is saying, one, I'm self-defining, meaning you don't define me, I define myself, and you take that or not. Because it doesn't matter what we think about God if God has already defined himself and he is a self-defining being. He says, I am who I am. Now that word or that phrase, I am who I am, or Yahweh, it's been translated a variety of different ways. Billy Graham used to try and make it super simple, and he would say this, that Yahweh, that means everlasting to everlasting. People like John Piper had tried to expand on different ways, and John Piper would just say that word Yahweh means God is. And he had 7 things that God is. He said God exists. God, there's no reality that exists behind God. God does not change. God is not inexhaustible of any energy. He is objective, and we conform to God, not God conforming to us, and that God draws near to us. And that's what John Piper would say. And as I studied this is, and especially in light of that word ma, the what, about God's reputation and character, from one theologian, I thought that this is the best way to define that in light of this scenario, is that God is saying this: I am truly he who exists and who will be dynamically present then and there in the situation to which I am sending you. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it's really good. When he says, I am who I am, he's saying, I am truly he who exists and who will be dynamically present then and there in the situation to which I'm sending you. I love that word dynamically, because that word dynamically is showing that God is characterized by this constant change, activity, or progress before your situation, during, and after. That he was then, and he's already there, and that he's dynamically present in the very situation that he's sending you to be in. This is God's name forever, a name denoting God's person, character, authority, power, and reputation all in one. And maybe you've asked this question to God before, what is your name? But we ask it in this sense oftentimes today, is where are you? Where have you been? Do you even care? And what do you mean to me given the circumstances that I find myself in today? And we ask that often, and we object and go, wait, so you're going to ask me to go do this thing? Where have you been my whole life? Do you even care about what I've gone through or where I find myself in today? That in the midst of us feeling hurt, afraid, broke, whatever situation, God in the midst of that, he comes and he says, I am who I am. A, you don't define me. B, I'm personal. I'm immanent. I'm among you. I'm present. I was then and I'm there already, and I'm dynamically present in this situation and where I've called you. I'm already there dynamically working. And God still sends us even in the midst of difficulty. God still sends us even when we don't like the circumstances we find ourselves in. So Moses says, well, what about me, God? God just says, I will be with you. And he says, well, what is your name? What's your reputation? How are they going to respond and believe me? And he just says, I am who I am. I'm then, I'm there, I'm dynamically present. And then we'll get to the last piece here, where Moses in his heart is fearful, and we're going to answer the question of what about Pharaoh? Because God knew that Moses feared Pharaoh in his heart. And he's, in many ways, Moses is saying, what's your reputation to them? He's also saying, what's your reputation in light of Pharaoh? Because here's Pharaoh's reputation. Pharaoh, he's powerful. You know what? He keeps his word, and his word is harsh. And who are you in light of Pharaoh? And what about Pharaoh? What are you going to do? How are you going to beat the most powerful man in the known world today? And this is how God responds. He says, I know the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand, meaning his grip is deep. And this is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. You will suffer resistance along the way. So, in verse 20, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonder that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And God's saying here that I am transcendent. I am over everything. I am far more powerful than Moses. I'm immanent, I'm among you, and I'm with you. I'm present, and I'm dynamically there working. And that my presence will be with you. My favor will be upon you. And my power will be demonstrated through my character. And I'm dynamically present. So we might not say, well, what about Pharaoh? We might say like, well, What about this situation? Maybe it's, what about my marriage? There's no way you're going to fix that. What about this diagnosis? What about my financial situation? Are you going to be there in that too? And God says, yes, I'm over all and I'm in all. And even in the midst of that, we say like, hey, I'm broke and I'm broken. You're still going to call me? Yes, and I'll be dynamically present in that. I'm hurting and you're still going to call me and send me? Yes, I'm going to be dynamically present in that. That he doesn't want us to remain idle. He wants to use us. And that we can be assured that God will accomplish his mission. He has not forgot you. He is faithful and he is good. And he wants to use you. Even in the midst of whatever situation you're in, God will use you if you respond like Moses did. Here I am. Use me. Would you pray with me? And that maybe for some of you, you've been out of relationship with God for a long time, maybe like Moses. And right now, he might be interrupting you and calling you back to him. That God is with you and that he's here to forgive you and he wants a relationship with you. And so for some of you, maybe you need to respond for the very first time, I want a relationship with that God. For some of you, you might need to rededicate your life and say, I want to come back to him. And that God wants a relationship with you. He desires that. This is the story of redemption. And he'll use you. And so if that's you, would you just pray with me? And like Moses, it doesn't have to be anything grandiose. It's just a little flame. You can respond and say, here I am in this very situation. And just pray, God, I'm coming back to you. Rededicate my life to you. Would you come into my heart and fill me, lead me and guide me? Would you use me and send me into a very hurting world? Here I am, and I'm willing. And I pray this in your name.